Podcast. I don't know if it's morning when you're listening to this, but it doesn't really matter because I've got Christian Berger here with me of Berger Consulting Group. And as promised, he and I are going to talk about probably what I'll consider the foundational building block of your data structure, which is data governance today. Good morning, Christian. How are you?
Morning, Robert. Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We want to talk about, first of all, data governance. A lot of times that sounds, whenever you hear the word governance, it kind of sounds like we're going to, be sitting in a cold building with pillars and, those types of things. Going to sit in some government building, in some hallway
Sure.
waiting for some sort of service. What is data governance? Let's just start with the definition. What is it?
Well, I would say that the way the industry seems to be gravitating is the idea of governing, managing, controlling the firm's data. Now, that would be data that's in your own systems, data that might exist in other systems, the access to that data, the publication of that data, control, all of that. So it's just a more formal structure around the firm's data.
Okay.
And it's
Very
really
good.
come into being in the last maybe 5 or so years as contractors have come to realize the value of that data, the importance of it to the firm in terms of reporting, the sensitivity of that data, and how, particularly with all the hacks that go on nowadays, disgruntled employees, all these things just make it more important to properly manage and control the data. But I think there's also, it's not strictly speaking just a security issue. I think it's even a usability issue. So how are you making that data available to people that need to publish in Power BI or Tableau, be able to run queries, be able to integrate data from one system to another? I mean, there's so many aspects to this. So it's become a topic in most firms now. They're still not quite staffed for it as they should be, but it is getting management attention.
Yeah, I noticed this is reminds me of when my calculus teacher would say, you have to have the same units, right, in order to be able to carry on with the formula. Meaning you got to be talking in the same terms, first of all. So your data works the same way. We have to have the same kind of terms for things. OpenBIM has a process where they are talking about, hey, we need to define these different sets the same way across the board if we're going to communicate our data issues and our data, even beyond that. The metadata even has to be the same on certain things. I totally get that. And construction companies, smaller, mid-sized ones, especially, who are looking to grow in the market, they really need to understand this. If they want to get into these bigger jobs and get into these bigger things, they need to understand that, guess what? Their data and how it matches up and how it's organized is going to be probably their biggest asset as far as efficiency.
Well, yeah, certainly. I think that's right. And I think that what's been interesting is as an industry, we've been so dependent on reports. And I'm actually getting to the point where I don't even like to use the word, but just static reports that get printed out or produced from your ERP system or your HR platform or your project management solution. We don't give any thought to the underlying data. And one of the places or ways that this manifests is you go into some construction companies and they have a proper ERP system in place that has a job cost application. But over the years, they've built 6, 8, 10 different job cost reports, one for every project manager who had a good idea about something. Or worse yet, you actually extract the data into an Excel spreadsheet, and that's your job cost report. All of these sort of problems, if you will, symptoms, lead back to this notion of data governance. And I think there's both a underlying data issue, like where's the data, how is the data produced, what does it mean? But then there's also sort of the other side of it, which is the publication of that data in some kind of graphical form, dashboards, queries, alerts. I mean, there's so much today that can occur with that data, and you really have to give careful thought to how you're calculating those numbers and what they actually mean. I've seen a number of cases where companies are running reports, running queries, dashboards, and they haven't even really gotten a good solid definition of what those values mean and how they trend.
Yeah, well, I see that a lot of times. There's I think it's the wrong way, but to track productivity, I think there's a big difference between progress and productivity. There's certainly a big difference between productivity and budget. I know a lot of companies are still looking at the dollars and cents to say, well, I'm in budget, so therefore I'm productive. And that's not right, right? That's for me, that's the wrong definition, because
Sure.
you can easily pencil whip those numbers, move a few hours over here, move a few materials over to here, you know what
Yep.
I mean? And get the attaboy, right? Make it look good. And then all of a sudden now you've got two problems there. You've got one, your data structure is ruined,
Yep.
because we've got falsified hours in a cost code somewhere, which says it doesn't represent exactly what you've done in units over hours or anything like that. And then two, you've got a process that's broken. And the process itself, it says, hey, this is okay to do this to make these numbers look right. And I feel like that is a terrible habit, that some of these companies had gotten into. Whether they grew up with it, it was something that they did when they, worked with another company, and it was just, this is how they did it. And so this is how I understand it. And so then everybody kind of jumps on that same board. But yeah, I'm in agreement with you on this whole thing of the data governance part, the importance of data. I did just my last podcast had a segment on how Skanska, you know, starts with a program. They actually have a training program to explain what what
Yeah.
data does, right, for their groups.
Yep. Well, I think that's a key element, is that training. I'm glad you brought that up. The big element of governance is just training on, why is this so valuable? What are the risks? Why do we not do this behavior anymore? Trying to help people understand how the data is getting used. And I think that's being well received, I would say.
Yeah, well, I don't know how, on a ground level, a lot of times, you start to look at the data, and then you start to realize where the mistakes are happening, or where somebody's, again, pencil whipping something, and they know it. You see it time and time and again where you catch people, oh, you've been kind of pencil whipping these numbers, and nobody likes that, right? And that's one of the things I advise on is, hey, you've got to stop, especially when you get into this mode of examining your data and really start to get results from it. Guess what? You're not going to like what you see probably initially, and you
Mm,
can't penalize people for doing the process. You have to go, okay, everything equal across the board. We're going to find mistakes. We're going to find people who've been maybe pencil whipping here. There's no penalty for that, right? And I
yep.
think that would be a big step for some of these companies to kind of take, because they're going to have to realize that they're going to have to live with a few mistakes in order to get past that pain point, right?
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that kind of, again, when they start to roll this out? What do you think about that?
I think it's like many things in technology. It's sort of a crawl, walk, run, or a staged approach, what have you. So getting your data cleansed, as they say, or normalized, is a good first step. Starting to train people in a given area, like project managers or in payroll HR or estimating, wherever it happens to be, is a good first step. And then continue to roll out from there. And what happens is your maturity, your sophistication with the data becomes greater and more valuable, I would say, too, to the point where you're even getting able to start looking at predictive analytics, trends, that sort of thing. I'm going to use an example. Let's take a look at estimating. I mean, everybody in construction seems to have some notion of their hit rate. How many jobs do we win versus how many do we bid? And better ones are able to look at that hit rate by sector of work, like healthcare versus schools versus something else. Some of them are able to look at it by the size of the job, or who the estimator was, or who the customer was. And I think that's good. But then you've even got to go further than that and look at maybe the type of building or facility that it is, how much margin you put on. You can start doing some analytics to determine what are the causal factors that influence your win-loss. And what that should tell you is, stop bidding work to this customer or in this market sector,
Yeah.
or this estimator needs to be trained better. There are things you can learn, and information should change behavior. And I think that That's why the data is so, because information actually will change behavior. It will. Now, whether it's right or not is a separate.
Well, yeah,
So
let's
it,
get past that. We have again. I think when I looked at this, and this kind of leads to this next thing about approach, because I think what happens to a lot of business owners, construction business owners or leaders, is they go, well, where's the best place to start, right? Where do we get started here? We know we've got to get on top of our data management. Okay, where do we start?
well, I think any organization should be focused on probably several steps. One would be defining what constitutes your data. It's not just data in your ERP. I mean, technically speaking, you've got a lot of data in spreadsheets and email and all of that. You've got estimating systems, project management system, HR data. So you've got data in a lot of places. So let's define what our data is, then look at where it is, then begin looking at the security aspect. How is that controlled? Is it password protected? Is it domain protected? How do we control access? How much data do we have sitting in other people's systems, for example? Then you can begin what I am seeing a little bit of now, and I think it's going to continue to grow, particularly in larger companies, is this notion of a data owner. So for a while, we've had process owners. So I'm just going to take an example of procure to pay. Procure to pay is a process, a value stream, whatever you want to call it, of bill of material to an RFQ to a requisition to a PO to a receipt to a payment. Like that whole stream is a single value stream. Well, that process could have been assigned to a process owner, and that process owner has responsibility for making sure that that entire process is as efficient as possible. It could cross multiple systems, frequently does. Well, then from there, you really make, by a quick extension, you go to this notion of a data owner. The data owner is someone who basically understands and knows the underlying data to that process and what are the key metrics, what are the key drivers, values in that string.
They're able to like figure out what they're looking to extract from the data that they
Yes.
currently.
Yes. And I think that their role sometimes isn't, they don't have to be the one to define it all, but they know who the people are that are interested in that data. So estimating, as an example, has a keen interest in some of that procure to pay data. But what they want to see and look at is different than what the accounts payable department may be interested in, like lost discounts, for example. And it could also be different than what the field or project management wants to see. They want to see vendor performance. So
Right.
if you look at a value stream like procure to pay, each constituent has a different interest in the underlying data. And so
Correct.
the process owner, the data owner are the ones who basically serve all of those masters.
Right. Correct. And so you talk about this, and we've touched on this before in some of our past conversations, whether it was on a podcast or just you and I kind of talking at some conference. Data lakes. You talked about this kind of at length at certain points, but can we help define like a data lake? What is that? Is that something that's owned by the contractor, by the construction company, a server somewhere? What is this? Can you kind
Well,
of extrapolate?
sure. It's generally the notion of having a large scale warehouse, if you will, to aggregate all of the firm's data. But it's still in that data lake approach, there's still quite a bit of structure, maybe not absolute final structure, but there is some structure in that data. It's not just the junk drawer that we
The
have in our
catch all,
house where
yeah.
everything accumulates.
We call them keepers. We're going to put these are keepers. We'll put those over there.
Yeah. So it can be in the cloud, like Azure or some other cloud warehouse. And it's typically fed by either query API tools that go in and get data from ERP, HR, project management, security, safety, whatever. Or you have middleware in place, which is tied to your primary systems and feeds that data lake. Now, there are also fairly good regimented controls around how that data ends up in the data lake. It's not just like turn on the valve and in it goes, because you go from data lake to sort of smaller subsets, cubes sometimes they're called, and there are solutions that call it data, like data bricks, and there's other things where basically we extract and optimize data from the data lake into these cubes, which are high performing and limited to their use case.
Right. So it's
So
kinda like
yes,
tagging the information that's in the data lake so that it's easier to find, or it's,
yeah,
we
I
could
would
start
say
with that.
that's pretty accurate. And the thing that I would say is that the data lake is it's not necessarily in a raw state, but it's really unrefined for the use case that may exist. So all of a sudden, let's say that project management has a need for some dashboards in Tableau or Power BI, and they want to look at project performance, project health, risk, cost fade or margin fade, production productivity, whatever they want to see. Well, all right, I can extract from the data lake into a cube that gives me the data I need for that, including some formulas that maybe need to be run. Then you put Power BI or Tableau over the top of that, and I've got the dashboard I need to publish, and it's going to be high performing. The other thing that I feel like is a factor in all of this is defining what you actually need. So some companies are like, I need this data to be real time. There can be no lag. Other companies are like, well, if this is within half a day or 4 hours or a day or whatever the time frame is, then because I don't think you really want to be hitting your production systems with all these queries, all these dashboards all the time, because what that'll tend to do is slow performance.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's another benefit of
So
the
so, we're talking about, data lakes and kind of being able to pour a Tableau or a Power BI and those types of things. And I'm thinking about when I think about companies, 200 to 500 employees, or sometimes under 200 employees, and they want to make that jump because they're feeling that they're at a plateau, right, somewhere but they want to make a jump into these bigger jobs and those types of things. And they're looking for the type of people that can help them because maybe they don't have that internal knowledge or that internal hire that understands the scope of this. Is that a big thing right now? I mean, I think I would feel like, especially with the number of people not jumping into construction, but being able to analyze that data, understanding what it means to pull a Power BI report, understanding what it means to create that, understanding what it means how to use it. What are your
well, so it's a really good question, actually. I think firms that are in that 200 million and down range, they might have a data analyst. Now, the data analyst isn't an architect. They're more of a publisher. So they'll look at the data, they'll pivot the data, they'll graph the data, they'll build the dashboards. They're masters in Power BI, Tableau, Click, some of these other platforms. And that's what they'll do all day, every day for that firm. But there's no underlying data architecture being developed. There's no data governance put in place. That's not that person's role. I also think that you want to be careful sometimes that you don't sort of head into very deep water in terms of the build that you're signing up for. If you hire a data, I mean, for example, if you were to hire a data architect, you're looking at not only big money for them, but then all the spend that comes with them to build out the architecture and the path with the piping and all of that. I think in some ways it's better to find maybe some ready-made solutions that are out there that are promoting the idea of aggregating data, delivering data, like prefabricated, if you will, data warehouse capabilities. There have been a few attempts at that. I would say the success is mixed on that one, but we are getting much closer. And I think that that's the path that a lot of firms, small to mid-sized firms, are
Yeah.
going to take.
I was gonna ask you about that as well, because I'm sure you get asked a lot. Obviously, that for these smaller firms, that best solution is kind of out of the box. Hey, this is what we have. You've always been fairly solution agnostic, meaning, hey, we're one solution better than the other. I'm in agreement with you. I don't necessarily know that there is one solution better than another. I think it more has to do with the fit with the company. There
Sure.
are a lot of solutions out there that work very well, and it's how it pairs, with what the company does at the time. I think though, as we move forward, some software companies and some construction companies are going to excel more because they have what we're talking about is that expanded or that accelerated data structure because they're basically speaking the same language. And I want to
Yeah.
get your kind of thoughts on that because beyond that, the idea is to get there, we've got a lot of change management that we're going to have to kind of move towards in better practices. I kind of
Yeah.
wanted to talk to you about that.
Well, that's a very fair point. That's why I like starting a little bit more narrow and smaller in scope. Like, let's make a success. Developing some dashboard in Tableau off of your ERP data is not really the journey. That's something people are doing today. It's fairly easy. And I would say, I mean, it's not a bad step, but it's not getting you moving toward the end state. I would say that for me, if I was advising a company, I would say, let's determine of these value streams in the organization, which one is most valuable? Where is the most value? And typically that can be in things like production and productivity. It can be in procurement. It can be in equipment management. It could be in safety. It could be in job cost and billing. Like, find out where that is. Then second step would be, what are the KPIs and metrics that are most helpful to manage to or from? So if it was procurement, how often are vendors on time with their delivery, getting the best price, being able to see our committed cost versus our what's required to spend for a given job. Like, there's so many metrics in that process that would be worth looking at.
Yeah.
And
Well,
determining is the data, are the systems and the data that you have any good for
yeah. Well,
giving
and
you that?
you got my wheels turning on that whole thought process. One of the things that I think about, um, from when, from when I owned my own company and to, what I did in commercial construction and being, managing projects and doing those kind of things. A lot of folks always talk about measuring what I'll call uptime. They want to monitor. Obviously, there's a productivity, measure of, hey, how many units per hour that you kind of want to get into. And I always thought, well, I can do that. You know what I mean? I can compare ourselves to maybe to, other things. I can compare week to week what uptime looks like. But one of the things we don't measure, and this is the thing about procurement, right, is downtime. Right. And you start to talk about vendor performance. Well, how much time is my crew out in the field or my crews out in the field waiting on a vendor to deliver? Right.
Yep.
How much downtime is there? And is that it seems like a soft cost kind of metric, but if you can really get into it, get into the weeds with it, check out that proper data, you can really come up with some, good answers as to whether this is viable or not.
Yeah, I like your example, excuse me, but I feel like that leads you to another problem is we don't collect today all the data that we need in order to provide some of those metrics.
Hmm.
And it's very difficult to even get good data, particularly from the field, on stuff that's absolutely necessary, like time card data. Like, that's hard enough. Getting PO receipts in is nearly impossible. And now we're going to talk about tracking downtime. These guys would just not sit still for that. So I think this is where I think this notion, and I'm going to introduce a new term that's pretty important, is called data harmonization. So now, instead of just pulling from one system, I'm actually pulling from 2 or 3 systems into that data lake or data block cube and harmonizing that so that I can relate my material delivery data to my time card data. So now I can check productivity and I can look over time at when was I most productive, when was I least productive, compare that to both my material delivery, my equipment availability, my schedule, weather data. Like,
Yeah.
I can start, like, think about an outdoor utility crew that does a lot of trenching and pipe stuff. Well,
Yeah.
their productivity should ebb and flow with weather.
Right. Yeah.
So, but being able to harmonize this data is a pretty powerful element, and I'm not sure that a lot of companies have gotten to that point yet.
So, we first started talking about this, it's that whole, crawl, walk, run idea. And you have a very valid point about, getting that accurate information from the field who are kind of already overloaded with just what they have got to get done in the first place. You're
Yep.
never going to get it. My thing is you've got to be able to not only expect the human update of information, kind of data, but we really need to start focusing on how to utilize, IoT devices and those types of things to get a digital representation of what's going on in the field. And I know that everybody's got, well, I got a camera. We're looking at camera for safety, or we got cameras for, check in, check out, those types of things. There's so much more, especially when I talk about the age of AI, there's so much more that those IoT devices can do in implied putting in information, collecting information that again, it takes the weight off of the field folks who feel like they're counting screws or they're counting grains of sand on a beach. Why am I counting all this stuff? I don't want you to do any of that. What I want you to do is I want you to go in, I want you to go to work, and I'm going to use these devices, to, check
Well,
things out.
yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the fascinating aspects, back to that idea of the utility contractor that's on a very long job. Well, being able to fly a drone over a job site and have it take pictures and measurements of production is an awfully appealing way to go about doing that. And you're not burdening the field with doing all that measurement and data collection.
Correct.
So
You
I
can
think
you
that
can garner a lot of information from,
absolutely.
those types of things. With the amount of information that's in there, a properly trained AI of some sort would certainly be able to extract some of the things maybe that you don't even see,
Yep.
from a visual
Oh,
standpoint.
yeah. Well, and I mean, here's another example, but we have technology now in the realm of safety, which can, if there's a mounted camera at a job site, it's taking photographs and video and it's analyzing the photographs and video to actually see who doesn't have a hard hat on, who doesn't have their safety vest on, fall protection, we don't have trenching. Like all of those things are achievable. So now that data can get extracted and put into data warehouse. So now I can do analysis on the safety of my job sites and what are my most frequent risks, do predictive analytics, who's going to have a problem. So I think that we're going to be overwhelmed. We already are. We're already overwhelmed with access to too much data. We don't have it structured very well. We're not publishing it very well. We're not interpreting it very well, but we're already overwhelmed. And that's without a lot of IoT, without a lot of AI. So this area has got to get cleaned up and structured. And I think that's part of what governance and management need to attend to.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's the thing. It's like there's what was a McKinsey or a Deloitte statistic or something, like 95% of the data that we collect it doesn't get used at all. We we don't even touch it. And that's, in the whether that's in the construction industry or just any industry at all, there's a lot of wasted data. And I'm sure the question comes out, well, do we need that much? Is it Pareto's law? Do I only need 20% to get 80% of the result? Is that what I need? If I got 20% would be better than the zero that I have now.
Well, it's funny you say that because I've been in a number of companies where we're doing some assessment work and it's like, well, all right, who looks at this report? And the answer is, well, we don't really know. I'm like, why are you producing it? Well, we just always have. And so
Mhm.
no one ever questions why this information is being collected. It's just done. So to your
We've
point,
always
I
done it
think
that way.
yeah, yep. So I think that there is some of that. But again, I would go back to what is the most valuable thing to know about a given area, back into the data that you need to provide KPIs and metrics, and then evaluate what you're collecting, what you don't need to collect anymore, and then how you're going to collect it. What are the risks with its accuracy, with its timeliness, and off you go.
Yeah, and I'm in agreement with you. I think it's a lot of times people get overwhelmed with the amount of things that they could do, right? And they don't take the time. Again, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? You're so involved in the day-to-day business of being in construction projects, project problems, those types of things. And you're trying to find some answers, but yet you don't step away, I'll say, long enough to truly evaluate, what is important to you, right?
Right.
And pick your best 3 or pick your best 2.
Yep. I feel like once you start that process with one area, one functional area, safety, estimating, procurement, and you really build a sound model, that model extrapolates out to any other area. It's the same process, just different data. If you already had a business analyst, you could use them to take this on. And I would almost advocate first and foremost for a business analyst before a data analyst, because the business analyst is able to help you improve business process, which yields presumably better data. And then once you're ready to start analyzing and publishing data, that's the role of the data analyst. But I do think that I wouldn't expect, and this is kind of key, I wouldn't expect the data analyst to come to a meeting and be able to say what is the most valuable data. It might in a given process area. I mean, those are the owners of that process, the data owner, the process owner who knows what's meaningful, what is predictable or predictive. So I think I would don't have that expectation of the data analyst.
Yeah.
They can run graphs and charts and dashboards all day long, but the real nuggets that should come out of that data would come from the business owners.
I got you. So we've talked a lot about this, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about examples of data governance kind of directly improve projects or outcomes, business insights for a client. Can you kind of give me an example of, you talked a bit about the procurement process. That seems like something that maybe something you've been working on with a certain client.
Well, it's interesting. We're doing a couple of data projects right now where we're going in and helping the company evaluate the existing data warehouse and data models, the existing publishing, the existing governance, security, and helping them. This is a bigger organization, but we're helping them develop the framework, the architecture for having a high performing data warehouse. And so that's very interesting. But one of the places we're starting is with the users, with the people that are going to use the data, the managers in these areas to determine what they need. Then we can back into all the technology that comes in behind it. We're also, I would say the other thing that we're looking at in here in these kinds of engagements is the IT structure. So a lot of construction firms have a IT structure that came from 20 years ago where they had to maintain their own servers. And they've slowly evolved from that, but there's still some remnant. And you now have IT firms that have a little bit stronger leadership, but they're so busy putting out fires day to day, dealing with security, dealing with supplier vendors. They don't have a chance to really sit back and contemplate their data strategy. So we need to start thinking about the way our IT departments are structured and how they're going to serve the rest of the organization.
And it is almost like you need kind of two heads of the department somehow and working in tandem, because I know the security issue is giant. Just the day-to-day putting out fires of the security measures, especially when you've got a lot of users, you've got a lot of vulnerability, those types of things. That's a full-time job in itself. And I think that is what happens a lot of times to folks when they say, well, I've got an IT, department, and I've got a head of department, and they should be able to handle all these things. Like, there's a mentality at certain levels where it's like, well, they should be able to, that's their thing, right?
Yep,
Well,
exactly.
there probably is another role in there that says, hey, look, you focus over here, and then we're
Yep.
going to come together weekly and talk about what the focus, how it interacts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the things I'm hearing more as a term, it's maybe a bit trite, but is, becoming a data-driven organization. So you really can't expect IT to be the genesis of all of this. They're the mechanics. They're the people that put the tools and the technology in place to deliver the data, the information. But you've got to but the business doesn't even know how to articulate that need. They kind of have some vague ideas, but so bringing the smart technical people alongside the smart operational people to develop that vision, that direction, and begin to execute is a challenge.
Yeah, because it is one thing to have the data and being able to extrapolate, but then there's the okay. So what do we do with it now that we have it? We've got it all organized. What do we do with it now that we have it? How do we make data driven
Yep.
decisions, which is a whole nother level? I really want to talk to you a little bit about the change management portion, the adoption portion of it, and kind of the acceptance and your experience with that. And because literally, I was just kind of in between our conversations here, I was just on LinkedIn where, somebody's saying, well, you don't really need AI. What you need is construction tech that works. And for me, I was like, yeah, well, it's an easy way to say it. But in 2 to 3 years, you're going to wish that you had been preparing yourself
Absolutely.
for what's coming on. So I kind of wanted to get your idea about adoption. And you spoke to me earlier about like the leadership, executive leadership on that.
Yep. So, it's always, excuse me, beneficial to go back in time and look at how we used to do things just as a way of kind of gauging how to move forward in a better way. So if you can remember back 10, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, a lot of IT initiatives were undertaken by IT. And so IT would be told, hey, go implement this software and then roll it out. And IT was heavily involved, but there was no executive sponsorship. Nobody raised their hand and said, I'm the exec, I own this. If you have any issues, come to me. And we just ended up with or worse, a rogue project team or a rogue department would go off and do their own thing without any involvement from anyone. So in today's environment with so many solutions out there and so much data at stake, I think that the company should have at the senior management level sort of determined that data analytics and perhaps AI are part of the future. We are going to push hard over the next 18 months to design, deploy, license, whatever the technology, and that as a policy, we will have an executive sponsor assigned to any and all primary initiatives. So let's say we're taking on the deployment of a project management solution. Well, somebody from operations at a senior level should say, this is important to the company. We are going to do this. In 9 to 12 months, we are going to decommission all these spreadsheets we've been doing, and we're all going to be on this platform. That's got to be their message. And then they stay associated close to the project and progress. They're just not in every meeting, reading every memo. And the other thing that companies do now that I think is beneficial is they're sort of forming their own project management office. So it might be a project manager, project coordinator. It could be a project manager, a business analyst. It doesn't really matter, but having a team, a person or a team that is there to actually help with deployment. They're not the ones implementing. They're organizing, are leading, directing, but they're not doing. I think that's a pretty big thing. And a typical PMO could handle 2, 3, 4 deployments at one time because they're not the ones having to do all the work. They're just having to manage. They're putting project management practices in place around these deployments. The other thing that I would say is that, if I were a CIO, I'd want to have a conversation with my CEO and say, all right, guys, what are the boundaries here? What's the framework and the guidance around non-compliance? So for example, we put in a purchasing system and we determine that we've made a decision, any purchase over $2,000 is going to have a PO. Any purchase over $10,000 is going to get a receiving ticket in. That's the policy. Now, if we have a project team that decides they don't want to participate, they're too busy, is that acceptable? And are we going to lean in and help educate those individuals, or are we just going to permit it? Because every time you permit non-conforming behavior, you're just reinforcing that it's okay. And I think that that's an element of risk that's there with so many projects. And the CEO or somebody in that C-suite has to basically say, no, I see the benefits of the organization. I'm fully committed to it. And if we have issues, I'll take them on. Because a typical PMO or a department manager may not have the sufficient authority, political or otherwise, to push it forward. So the executive leadership, the executive sponsorship is the messaging is all very, very important.
It's extremely vital. And I think you bring up a good point. We've entered into this strange environment in some companies and I'll just say in business in general, where it feels like the employer-employee relationship is a bit flipped, right? Where when the employee says, maybe I don't want to do that, or that's not something I need to do, and there is no, there's no forcing it because, well, the employer then says, I need the help, you know, I can't do without this position. This leaves me very vulnerable in certain areas. And that's a difficult position for an owner or a leader to be in. And so that, yeah, I totally agree with you. Those boundaries have to be set. So you're not only setting structural boundaries for your processes or the new processes that you're trying to pull in, but you're also setting some I will get human resources boundaries in there, right?
Yeah, the way I look at it, Rob, the emphasis used to be like, "Oh, let's go get a procurement platform." So they go buy a procurement platform and they try and implement it, but they put none of the policies, none of the procedures in place around that platform. And so it's up to each project team whether or not they're gonna use it. And I
Mhm.
think that's just a grave mistake. I think what you have to do first is say, what are we trying to accomplish with this procurement platform? And what are we establishing as policies around this? And none of it has to do with the software. This is just how do we want to operate? So
Mhm.
process, policy, procedure, then when you start to deploy the software, it's within that framework. And that
Yeah.
feels pretty important.
And Hamza Shambari, if you know him from Haskell, he's probably been on a few of the committees or panels I'm sure that you've been on
Sure.
in some of the conferences, but his book, Paperless Builders,
I've got that.
yeah, it defines that specific first. It's almost like the Simon Sinek, what's your why? But he says in this, if you're going to roll something out, everybody needs to know why first. It's not how, right?
Yeah.
It's first. The first
Well,
question
yeah.
is why.
100%. And I think you've really got to get stakeholders in that meeting first to
Yeah.
talk about the why. Like the be- the benefit of a procurement platform is broad. There's a lot of people that benefit from it, but if we don't get somebody from the field listening in, providing feedback, we run the risk that those receiving tickets which show up in the field aren't going to make their way back to the office. So getting input feedback from all the constituents is pretty vital.
So I've heard you mention procurement platform, quite a bit, and maybe that's just a single example. Do you feel like there are any set of platforms, areas where you're going to get more information rather than others, just more benefit from a procurement platform?
Well, so that's an interesting question. Yes, procurement platform was just an example. Maybe I'm dealing with one of those right now, and that's what came to mind. But what's interesting about that is that I think we used to have our legacy ERP system there for procurement, and we would enter in a PO, and then
Mhm.
we would send it to the vendor, and then we would get a receiving ticket back. We would enter that in, and that yields a certain amount of data, but it's also very narrow, and there's so much data that's missing. So what you get when you go into these larger platforms is the workflow. Now, because here's something that you can't gauge. When I look at a PO and I look at a receiving ticket, I can see how long it took. And I can tell, is this vendor performing according to expectation in terms of delivery? Yes or no? That's
Mhm.
good information. Did the project manager wait till the last minute to do the buy? And is the project manager behind in his buying? I don't know those things simply from looking at POs. But if I have a requisition bill of material in a system and I route it for approval and then I buy it, I can actually look at the time frame. How long does it take us to get from a bill of material requisition to a PO,
Mhm.
then received, then paid? I can look at time information and I can see that our expediting costs on these materials are very high because we're
Mhm.
not issuing POs until the last minute. So
Well, you can then combine that. If you could then combine that information with your scheduling, you got your Primavera schedule, and you're sitting there going, "All right, in that schedule, where did you order this material? Does this match up with what you have data wise over here?"
Well, and and I would argue that with that schedule data, you can even see where you've got risk because if I'm a senior exec at a construction firm and I'm looking at all my projects, what I want to look at is all the bill of materials that need to be bought and how much purchasing has been done.
Okay.
So if
Yeah.
I'm looking at your schedule and I see you've got critical path coming up and You, Mr. Project Manager, are way behind on your purchasing. We're going to have a conversation. That's what's been missing, in my opinion. What's been missing from so many organizations is they've been dealing with these kind of static solutions that focus on like a simple data element like purchasing, but it doesn't get the broader context of what's
Yeah.
going on.
Delivers lagging information, right? You're learning about the problems 2 weeks, 3 weeks after it's
Well,
already done. The damage is already in
yeah.
place,
Yep.
right?
Absolutely. So I think that, and that's maybe another term I'll put out there. It's not a new word, but maybe in this use is the contextualization. Like I bought $2.5 million of material on this job and it was delivered on time by the vendor. That's valid. That's useful, but it
Mhm.
doesn't have much context in the bigger picture of the procurement. Did we get competing bids? Are these vendors pre-qualified? Are they MBE, DBE suppliers? Did we purchase as soon as we needed to, but no sooner than we needed to?
That's a big one. That's a
Yeah.
big one right there.
So it's the contextualization of this data that where I feel like where you and I started this conversation was around data and analytics. And I feel like that's where we're going is greater context of the behavior of the company and the effectiveness of our processes
Right.
that come with better solutions.
Right. I think what it boils down to, again, as we started this conversation, is when you said like, well, you just need software tech that works, right? Well, do you? Because right now the ability for software technology to work is there, yes, but what seems to be inhibiting the software technology is humans' ability, A, to be able to
Well,
analyze the mass amount of data, but also their utilization of the tool is incorrect at best.
yeah. So um, that's a good point. And I think that's where it almost pays to sit down and examine one of these value streams, like we talked about, and determine what are the metrics and measures that are really important to this process, not just did we get our POs delivered on time? Think
Yeah.
about where's the value, where are the warning signs that we need on a given process so that we can know about them in advance. And this dependence on email and spreadsheets is really inhibiting our ability to get good data because those are just locked up in a program that's hard to analyze.
Together, but there's a lot of companies out there that are using legacy systems. They believe they have what they need, but they don't understand how much technical debt they're actually in. And getting around that again is also a part of this kind of optimization, getting ready for what I call the age of AI
Yep.
and getting construction ready for that. But,
Yep.
uh, that's
I'll
going to
look
be a big
forward to that
deal.
conversation. I have it almost every week.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Anyway, that's exactly what I want to talk to you about it again. But for today, I want to thank you for spending so much time with me. I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate it.
Well, I'm
And
I'm happy to do it, Rob, and I enjoy your podcast and hope your listeners will pull a couple nuggets out of this and be useful to their organization.
well, I'm sure they will. I'm looking forward to comments and questions from those folks. And then you and I will regroup and we'll pull another one together on technical debt, and hopefully we'll get just as much success out of that one. But until then, thank you so much. I look forward. I'll probably see you at the upcoming Procore ground break coming up in Houston here. So anyway,
Yep.
I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob. Bye, everybody.